Thank you for coming to tonight's edition of the Moose Family Speaker Series. And the Moose Family Speaker Series is co-sponsored by the Freshwater Society and the University of Minnesota's College of Biological Sciences. We greatly appreciate the support that the Mosaic Company Foundation is providing for this evening's event. And I especially want to thank Dr. Bob Eldey, Dean of the College of Biological Sciences and a former board member of the Freshwater Society, whom you will hear from later on this evening. And a special thanks, of course, to the Moose family for the Malcolm Moose Freshwater Fund. This endowment honors Malcolm Moose, former president of the University of Minnesota, from 67 to 74, and that fund principally provides the resources for this lecture series. And we're proud of this lecture series, the great speakers we have presented and the ones still to come. In fact, mark your calendars now. Our next Moose lecture presentation will be on May 1st by Don Rosenberry from the U.S. Geological Survey. He was part of the research on the shrinking White Bear Lake. He will be speaking on the interaction between groundwater and surface water, a very topical subject and one that I'm sure that there will be a lot of interest in. Tonight we're privileged to have as our guest Sandra Postel. She is an author and an advocate for valuing and protecting clean water wherever it exists. Many of you, in fact, have probably read at least one of her books, including Last Oasis, Facing Water Scarcity, which was the basis for a PBS documentary. She also wrote Pillar of Sand, Can the Irrigation Miracle Last?, and was a co-author of Rivers for Life, Managing Water for People and Nature. She is a National Geographic Society Freshwater Fellow, advising National Geographic on many water issues. And she's especially working with National Geographic to restore flows to the Colorado River. Her talk tonight will deal with climate change, world population growth, and their impact on water. It is titled, Will We Have Enough Water Adapting to a Warmer, Water-Stressed World? After Sandra Postel's talk, a panel of 3 Minnesota experts on water and climate will join her in taking questions. Dr. Eldey will moderate the panel discussion. I think you were given the opportunity for file cards when you came in, so please write your questions down as you think of them during the talk. And in addition, we'll have, those will be collected, and in addition, we will have roving microphones after the talk available for the question and answer period. I want to point out to you that in addition to live streaming tonight's program, there will be a link to archived video of the lecture on our website. We are privileged to host Sandra Postel tonight and pleased and appreciative of having all of you with us. She says that she is optimistic that ultimately we can get it right and stop abusing and overusing our most precious resource. I'm anxious to hear that presentation. Please join me in welcoming Sandra Postel.
Thank you, Jean, for that warm and kind welcome. I also want to thank very much the Freshwater Society and the College of Biological Sciences for inviting me here tonight to deliver the Moose Lecture. I'm flattered to be here. It feels like it's long overdue that I'm on this campus, so I'm just delighted to be here. I also wanted to thank all of you for coming out tonight. We have some steep competition tonight with the State of the Union address, right? So I'm hoping we'll all feel that the state of the world's water is at least as important as the State of the Union by the time the night is over. So tonight, think it's pretty clear to me now that the human story over the next several decades is going to very much be a water story. And the narrative of that story is being written every day by how we choose to use and manage and value fresh water. Demographers tell us that we're now a human family of 7 billion. We're heading toward 8 billion by 2025, 9 billion, we're told, by 2050. And so that raises some pretty difficult and interesting challenges for us. And I think the big frame that guides how I think about water and my work is this challenge. It's how we're going to meet the needs of 8 and then 9 billion people, while at the same time protecting the ecosystems that support not only our economies, but the rest of life, the web of life on the planet. And that's the big framework that really guides my work day in and day out. So what I hope to do this evening is to sketch out some of the dimensions of this challenge, and then offer up some solutions, some ideas for how we might address them. Can everybody hear me okay, by the way? Raise your hand if you can't. We need to go louder? No, you're good. Okay. So let's start out with a little map. What this is showing basically is a map of what we call water stress in the world today. And it's very simple. There are various permutations on this map. This one is just showing the ratio of our water use to how much is available. And don't worry so much about the colors on the bar on the side, but think about the areas that are marked in red in particular and orange. You can see quite a bit of the world is already in a water-stressed category. This map would have looked really, really different when I first started working on water issues 30 years ago. It would have looked very different. This is really a function of population growth, consumption growth, and the rising demand for water against a finite supply, river basin by river basin by river basin. So you can see where we're in some trouble. We're in some trouble in, of course, the western United States. In North Africa, not surprising. But look how much of Asia is in trouble. India, China, Pakistan. These are vast areas with billions of people, millions of acres of irrigated land that are already in this water-stressed situation. And not surprisingly, we're seeing increasing competition for water in these river basins. Competition between countries that share rivers, competition within countries, between farms and cities, for example, and competition between human uses for water and nature's needs for water in all of these places. And these areas are getting more widespread. We're going to see more areas turn from orange to red, more areas in red. And so this problem is going to get more and more difficult. What are we seeing in these areas? We're already seeing rivers, for example, running dry for extended periods of time throughout the year. We're seeing groundwater being depleted and all kinds of ramifications from that, which we'll talk about a little bit tonight. We have the dry Colorado River in the American Southwest. We have a dry Rio Grande in the American Southwest for a good bit of the year. And this is not even the tail end of the Rio Grande. This is the middle section of the Rio Grande, a shot taken last August. We have a dry Murray in Australia. The Murray is kind of like to the Australians what our Colorado is to us. Major water source for irrigation, economic activity. It's kind of their key river in the southeastern part of Australia, running dry for a good bit of many years. Groundwater has become an increasingly important and difficult challenge for us. It's literally underground, quite literally out of sight, out of mind, in terms of our understanding of it, our thinking about it, and certainly what we're doing about it. If you think about the overpumping of groundwater, which we're doing in many of those places you saw in red in the map, we're building up, in some sense, a water deficit, right? It's kind of a bubble in the economy that depends on that water that has to pop in some fashion at some point because it's literally unsustainable use of groundwater. We see this in many parts of the West, the Ogallala Aquifer, the Central Valley of California, a good bit of China, the North China Plain, northwestern India. These are very important regions for food production and for cities. And this overpumping is an increasing concern. was it 2 or 3 years ago, some Dutch scientists with some modeling work estimated that we've seen a doubling of groundwater depletion globally since 1960. And that's a concern, and it's increasing. On top of all this, of course, we now have this wild card of climate change, which impacts everything we're going to be talking about tonight in some way. Warmer atmosphere means more moisture is being held in the air. The water cycle is intensifying. And if you think about climate change and how we're going to experience it, most of the experience of climate change that will impact us, will be through the water cycle. More floods, more droughts, changes in river flows, more fire, which impacts water use by vegetation. All of these things are going to impact the ways in which water moves between the air and the sea and the land in that cycle we know as the renewable water cycle. A couple years ago, 8 hydrologists got together and published a very interesting and I think important paper in the journal Science called Stationarity is Dead. And what this means is that the natural variability we have come to understand through the hydrologic cycle is no longer going to be evident in the same way in the future. Let me phrase that a little bit better. The variability in the hydrologic cycle is fairly well known from recent data, but it's known within a set of boundaries. So the highs and the lows occur. There's certainly variability in the system, but it's within a knowable bounds that we've been able to plan on in terms of where and when we build dams, understanding whether the levees will hold the flood, this kind of thing. And what they're telling us is that increasingly we're outside that envelope now, that we can't expect to stay within those bounds. And just in discussing with some of you this afternoon, you're seeing in your own research that we're moving outside that envelope in significant ways. The droughts are getting deeper, maybe longer. The floods are getting more extreme outside that bounds. So it makes water management really challenging. How do we plan? How do we secure populations from floods? How do we make sure we have the storage we need? How do we plan on draining the storage in a reservoir if we're not sure how long that drought's going to last? And so it changes the dynamic of water management in pretty profound ways. And so grappling with this is a major challenge. And so if I think about what all this means in terms of security, global security, human security, we have now this kind of interconnected web of, if you will, water-related threats that are underpinned by water stress, that map that I showed, driven by population and consumption growth, which are continuing at a fairly rapid pace, and then magnified by climate change. The Pentagon now refers to climate change as a threat multiplier, not a direct cause of anything, but a threat multiplier, and it's beginning to pay attention because of this interconnected web of threats, which we're seeing impact, I think, these 3 very important features of our human enterprise: food security and food prices, ecosystems and their deterioration and decline, and then social and political stability. And these are all interconnected, and water and climate is going to magnify this set of relationships in some unpredictable and some very important ways. And I want to talk a little bit about these relationships and how solutions need to sort of take all of them into account if we're going to have any chance of meeting that challenge I set out at the beginning. So very quickly, a quick look at the global map of irrigated cropland. Irrigation is the cornerstone and has been the cornerstone of human civilization for thousands of years. And what's of concern is how much of that irrigation base, you can see here 18% of the world's cropland is irrigated. But that irrigated land gives us 40% of our food. So it's disproportionately important, right, to our food production. But when you look at what's happening, the areas in red, by the way, are the areas that are getting irrigation. You can see they're very concentrated. We've got the Ogallala in the central part of the United States, the Central Valley in California. We've got, of course, lots of irrigated area in Asia, the Ganges Basin, the Indus Basin, the Yellow River Basin in China. Half the world's irrigated land is in the U.S., Pakistan, India, and China. And the areas in red, if you would remember back to the first map, they overlay pretty carefully with those water stress zones. So the overpumping of groundwater, the depletion of rivers is happening a lot in these important irrigation zones. And so when you add up this dynamic, what you see is that somewhere between 10 to 15% of our current food supply is to some degree at risk from the use and overuse of water. If we take just groundwater, for example, the Dutch scientists and others that have estimated how much groundwater we're currently depleting, it's about 283 billion cubic meters. The number doesn't matter. But when you take that number and translate it into how much food it produces, at roughly 1,000 tons of water to make a ton of grain, we find that about 10% of our food supply today depends on the overpumping of groundwater. So that's kind of a bubble in the food economy. And it will, over time, pop. It's beginning to pop in places in India where farmers can no longer pump groundwater economically from deeper and deeper beneath their land. So this is a problem we're going to have to reckon with in one way or another. This is a very interesting trend to me, what's happening to food prices and what we see happening socially and politically when we get these spikes in food prices. You can see we kind of tracked along pretty well since 1990. This is the United Nations the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization's Index of World Food Prices from 1990 to 2012. And what happened is that we're tracking along, and then all of a sudden, 2008, we get this pretty dramatic spike in global food prices. And then again, another spike, even bigger one, in 2011. And what's driving these spikes increasingly, I think, are these four sets of pressures on food prices. The underlying water stress that we've been talking about, higher grain demand, particularly as China and other so-called developing countries begin to adopt the diets that we tend to eat, which include a lot more meat. As people increase their income, one of the first things they do is begin to diversify their diets and add more meat. Meat is a very water-intensive food product because it takes a lot of grain to make the meat. And you irrigate the grain, so it's a very water-intensive aspect of our diet. And so as China and India and other countries have added so much meat to their diets, that's increased pressure on grain supplies and grain prices. The diversion of crops to biofuels. In this country, we've been using about a quarter of our grain crop for biofuels in recent years. I think it's about 6% globally now. And then weather extremes, right? In 2011, we had this record-breaking heat wave in Russia. Heat wave, not a drought, a heat wave in Russia that knocked out 40% of the wheat crop. Australia, droughts and floods. China, droughts in particular. Of course, in the United States last year, record-breaking drought. This is happening, it seems, more often. And combined with these other pressures is causing this spiking to happen from time to time when there's a convergence of these factors. And what happened socially, politically in 2008? There were food riots and protests, and some violent ones, in about a dozen countries, from Haiti to Mauritania around the world. Some people think the Arab Spring resulted in part from the rise in grain prices in 2008. There's been some research done linking those two things. So the social and political stability and dynamic around that is something I think a lot of security analysts are beginning to watch and pay attention to. The relationship between food prices, climate, and social and political stability. My sense is we're not likely to see that flat line very much anymore, that we're going to have an increasing trend in prices and then this spiking, which is something new for us to watch. Let's think about ecosystems for a minute, the second set of concerns in that interconnected web of threats. To some degree, we're sort of in the situation where we're reaping some of the downsides of the engineering infrastructure that we built to help us control and manage water, in particular with dams. We had in 1950 about 5,000 large dams around the world. Now a large dam, according to the dam industry, is one that's at least 15 meters or 45 feet high. So we had 5,000 of those in 1950. We have about 50,000 of those today. So we've been building, on average, about 2 large dams a day, every day for half a century, right, if you just do the math. It's a big change in the hydrologic environment, in the river environment, in a very short period of time. I mean, half a century is nothing in geologic sense. So the impact on rivers and the life that's been living in those rivers, adapted to those rivers and habitats, has been dramatic. Now, of course, we built these dams for very good purposes, right? Flood control, hydropower, irrigation, water supply, recreation. But we didn't think too much about the ecological downsides, right, at the time that we built them in terms of the size and the location and how we operated them. And we're learning now that the freshwater ecosystem services that those river systems, those aquatic ecosystems provided to us were very important, and we've been losing them. This is a partial list of how freshwater ecosystems service our economy. And all these services run on free solar energy, right? Wetlands are purifying our water. They're removing pollutants, running on free solar energy. If we lose that capacity and have to build a treatment plant, it costs a lot more for the energy and the chemicals to run the plant. So we're losing these ecosystem services right at the time energy costs are going up, and so we're replacing, these ecological infrastructures, if you will, with engineering infrastructures that are a lot more expensive by and large. We've lost up to 50% of the world's wetlands and all the services they provide, from flood control to drought mitigation to water purification. We're intercepting, with large dams, we're now intercepting more than a third of global river flows. That's an enormous change in how rivers work. And we're trapping 100 billion tons of sediment, right, that rivers carried from headwaters to deltas, deposited on floodplains, brought to the deltas. So the Nile Delta, for example, is sinking, both because sea levels are rising and because the sediment, the 100 million tons of sediment that were brought down from the Ethiopian highlands, are no longer making it to the delta. So huge area of important farmland in Egypt is beginning to be lost as a result of these trends. And of course, the sediment brings the nutrients that support coastal fisheries. So the fisheries in the estuaries and the seas that receive this river water are no longer getting the nutrients that they need. So that has been broken, that has been severed. These are important services. One of the ecosystems, one of the stories that I think really provides a wake-up on how important these connections are is the story of the Aral Sea. How many of you know the story of the Aral Sea? Looks like about half of you, maybe a little more than half, which is great. This is the way the Aral Sea looked in 1985. We don't have any images of the Aral Sea, to my knowledge, before the Aral Sea began to shrink. For those of you who don't know the story, the Aral Sea used to be the world's fourth largest lake. And in the 1940s, early 50s, the Soviet Union decided, this is in Central Asia, excuse me for not locating this, this is in Central Asia. And the Soviet Union decided, just by a simple cost-benefit analysis, that the two rivers flowing into the Aral Sea, which sustained the sea, right, the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya rivers, would be more valuable if they were diverted to grow cotton in the desert. And so they did. They basically decided to divert the river flow. And so here's a chart showing the river flow into the Aral Sea from 1926 to 2009. And you can see for a long time things were just fine. And then after the construction of what is now the world's biggest water supply canal, the Karakum Canal, which takes waters out of the Amu Darya and moves it westward for irrigation of cotton in the desert, the flows dropped off down to about 10% of what they had been. So the Aral Sea was like a big swimming pool in the desert. If you don't have the water flowing in, you've got this enormous evaporation from the surface into the atmosphere, and the sea began to shrink. And so this is what we got. In 1989, it divided into a smaller northern sea. You can see that little, let's see. This up here, that little area up there is became a landmass. So the small northern sea got separated from the larger southern sea. and it continued to shrink. I was there about midway between these 2 years, 89 and 2003, and I remember, standing on a bluff in a little town called Moynac, which had been a port town in the Aral Sea, for the Aral Sea. The Aral Sea supported a tremendously productive fishery, 60,000 jobs, millions of tons of fish brought in every year. And this town had been an important fishing town, and I was standing on this bluff, and you could feel that the lake used to lap up against the shore of the bluff there. And I couldn't see the river. It was 20 miles away. Couldn't see it at all. It was gone from that area. 2003, it looked like this. By then, it had lost, I believe, 80% of its water. And then I was just blown away by this next slide. I was sitting at my desk in 2010 and 2009, the summer of 2009. And a report came in from Europe, from the European Space Agency, that said that the that right-hand big lobe in the southern part of the lake had shrunk another 80% in 3 years' time. So watch this next slide and think this happened in 3 years. Isn't that wild? So 3 years' time. So it became clear to me that we could be watching almost the complete disappearance of this ecosystem that had once been the size of Ireland, the fourth biggest lake in the world. It could disappear for all intents and purposes during our lifetime because of this change in the way water is managed. What they're doing now is basically they've diked off the upper part of the sea from the lower part of the sea in order to save just that little remnant in the north. There's now a dike between the upper and lower lakes so that water that's flowing in from one of the rivers in the north sustains that little bit of the lake. And they're basically sacrificing the large lower lake at this point. So it's a dramatic example, but in some way we're doing similar things in other places around the world. This is an extreme example. And I can tell you that when I was there, it just became so clear to me how connected, the health of a people and an economy and a society is to the ecosystem around them. The people's health was really dramatically deteriorated from the salt and the toxic chemicals and the lake drying up and blowing toxic sand and dust around. 90% of the women were anemic, and just a terrible situation. Lost jobs, people left. Moynac was like a ghost town when I was there. So it shows that connection and the importance of thinking through the ecosystem losses as we go about managing and using water. Lest we think it doesn't happen here, this is a very similar chart, right, of the Colorado River. I went down to the Colorado Delta the year after I got back from the Aral Sea, and you find a very similar situation. It's an unusual river in that most of it is in our country, but 10% of the flow and a good bit of the last leg of the river is in Mexico. And so the Delta has been sort of out of our mindset for a very long time. But a very similar story. Hoover Dam, 10 other dams, and the river flow is basically gone. The Delta is, at this point, a fairly decimated and desiccated place. It used to be an incredibly lush, vibrant marshland. If you've read Aldo Leopold's work, he called it a milk and honey wilderness after he canoed there in 1922. A land of green lagoons, beautiful place. And it's, for all intents and purposes, not that, except for a few remnants anymore. So this is the situation. So what do we do about this? What do we do about this? We could spend all night talking about climate and population because those are two very important drivers. Sure, but I don't think we want to do that tonight. But just keep in mind, I think we can't solve any of these problems without addressing the population pressure, the consumption pressure, and the climate pressures that are coming online for this picture. But let's talk about the water piece of this, the water piece of solutions. There's a real big silver lining in this picture, which is that we've had almost no good reason yet to use water wisely. We've been undervaluing it, underpricing it, assuming and acting as if it's limitless rather than finite. And so we have a lot of slop, if you will, in the system. We have a lot of waste and inefficiency in the system. And that's really the silver lining here. And so my sense is we need to think about ways, creative ways to double, triple, maybe even quadruple water productivity over the next 2 to 3 decades. And by water productivity, I mean value per unit water. So getting twice or triple as much benefit from every gallon we extract from the natural environment. Because if we're going to leave some for natural ecosystems, if we're going to leave some to restore ecosystem services, we've got to get a whole lot more efficient and productive with what we do take out from the natural environment. And the good news is there's a lot we can do there. And we're going to need it in agriculture, in industries, and in our cities and towns. And we can do a lot there. Super important in agriculture because agriculture accounts for 70% of all the water we do extract from rivers and lakes and wetlands. 70% of that goes to agriculture. So a lot of focus needs to be there. These are just a few of the ways we can think about raising water productivity, boosting water productivity in agriculture, irrigation efficiency, expanding access to irrigation. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Using rainfall more effectively. Here in Minnesota, here in the American heartland, we have incredibly rich agricultural real estate that is rain-fed. It doesn't need irrigation in most years. And so protecting and using rainfall more effectively is going to be crucial. 18% of cropland is irrigated. 82% is rain-fed. So using rainfall more effectively has a lot of potential. Adjusting cropping patterns and thinking about nutritional benefit per drop. How much nutritional benefit are we getting per drop of water that's used in agriculture? And if you add this up, you start to get toward a good bit of the way toward a solution to this dilemma. Just one example of irrigation efficiency, one of many. Drip irrigation. One of the most efficient ways we know how to irrigate. Drip irrigation delivers water directly to the roots of plants through perforated piping on or above the soil. And crops like this, they're getting just the amount of water they need. They often increase their yield because they're getting water in the right amount at the right time. So you often see a doubling or tripling of water productivity when you shift from conventional flood or furrow irrigation to drip irrigation. Very effective way to irrigate. Currently about 4% of global irrigated land is under drip. So we have a long way to go, about 7% here, and most of it here in the US, and most of that's in California. So we have a long way we can go. We're also seeing now, and this is, I think, really important in terms of meeting food needs. If we think about hunger in the world today, 60% of the people who are hungry, and there are about 850 million people who are hungry day in and day out, about 60% of them, ironically, live on farms. They live on farms, small farms, in South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. So if the concern is food to alleviate hunger, we need to look at what those farms are doing or not doing. And one of the things that's happening on those farms is the inability to grow crops during the dry season because access to irrigation isn't there. In some sense, the irrigation age, the modern pumps and the pipes and all that infrastructure has bypassed the poorest farmers, the farmers living on $1 or $2 a day. And so they have this land, but no way to make it productive enough. And so what's been happening in the last 20 years is a focus on designing irrigation systems for that are radically affordable. In other words, affordable by the $1 a day farmer. And so when I went to India and Bangladesh with the International Development Enterprise Group some years back when I was working on my irrigation book, we saw some of these systems, and they're really, really interesting. This is a low-cost drip irrigation system. It's not as fancy, it's not computerized, it's not the high-tech systems you see in Israel or California. It's a very modest system, but uses the same principles of drip irrigation, delivering modest amounts of water through a perforated hole as close to the crop's roots as you can. And so this farmer in Nepal was able to take water, limited water from a community cistern, put it in that blue container you can see in the back of the photo, and then run drip lines through his very modest field. This is probably 400 plants, and irrigate them using this simple modified drip system. And for these farmers, it makes a world of difference because they're growing vegetables. They know they're going to have water. They can grow higher value crops, and they can take those crops to market and earn some income. So it's a ticket out of that poverty trap that keeps those 60% of people not only poor but hungry. So these are really revolutionary systems. These are photos by a colleague, Jennifer Burney, at UC San Diego. She's been working on solar-powered drip irrigation project this is in Benin, in West Africa, relying on solar energy and a community solar system. Here's another, this is perhaps one of the most transformational technologies I've ever seen in the water space. It's called the Treadle Pump. And I first saw this in Bangladesh in 1998, but they'd been selling already before. And these are very simple water pumps that you kind of work like a Stairmaster in the gym. You kind of move up and down, and they pull water up through suction, shallow groundwater, through a suction mechanism, and it allows them to irrigate, in this case, rice, but also vegetables and horticultural crops that, again, they can take to market. This particular treadle pump cost about $35 and returned about $100 in the first season. Poor farmers are very risk averse, so they need a return right away, and this gave that to them. This groundwater was right beneath their feet, but until a technology came along that allowed them to access it, they couldn't grow anything, right, during that long dry season in Asia. So a very transformational technology. About 2 million of these has been sold in Bangladesh. And it's not that you're going to, treadle away for 4 to 5 hours for the rest of your life. The idea is that you get some income and then begin to invest in other ways of irrigating and growing food for your family and to create more income. Big shift in gears here from Bangladesh to Boston, but I want to talk for a minute about the conservation potential in cities, because this is super important. We have 10% of our water use in cities around the world, compared to 70% in agriculture, 20% in industries. But it's a very important 10% because it's very concentrated, right? Cities are a congregation of people, sometimes in the many millions, that depend on water from surrounding ecosystems. And so they put a lot of pressure on those ecosystems. So using water more efficiently in cities is very, very important. And again, we've barely tapped the potential here, which is the good news in some sense. This is just one example, one kind of near to me since I used to live in Massachusetts. But Boston faced the situation that many cities do. They faced it back in the mid-'80s where their water use was approaching the safe yield of their supply. And so they began to think about doing what most cities do, which is look for another source of water. And so they were proposing to divert water from the Connecticut River, the biggest river in New England, to the Quabbin Reservoir, which is the main reservoir for Boston. And conservation groups at the time were working on restoring salmon in the Connecticut and other restoration activities. And they said, hey, wait a minute. Can we look at conservation really seriously instead of going automatically to another big supply project? So the Massachusetts water authorities did that. And they implemented, starting in the late 1980s, a very progressive water conservation program. Not just education, but going door to door, installing water-efficient fixtures, auditing industries and helping industries recycle more water, reuse more water. Water prices went up because they were trying to clean up Boston Harbor at the same time. And yes, education. So the combination of all these things resulted in dramatic decline in water. Oh, yes, a very important one in older cities, fixing leaks in the distribution system. A lot of cities are losing 30, 40, 50% of their water to leaks, right, in the distribution system. So those measures together brought water use down. You can see here today, water use in the greater Boston area, about 2 million people, is 43% lower than it was at its peak. And water use today is back where it was 50 years ago. So there's no need for the diversion from the Connecticut. The Quabbin Reservoir is brimming. In fact, so much so that there's been talk about trying to use some of that water to restore the Swift River, which was dammed to create the reservoir. So it was a win-win for everybody. It cost about half as much to do the conservation as to implement the supply program, and it's been good for the environment as well. So this is just one example, but an important one, but it's not even an area of the country that's particularly dry, right? Water is fairly abundant in Boston, but conservation made sense, and it worked. So doubling water productivity, tripling water productivity. Another very important thing I think we need to think about doing is strategically rebuilding what I would call our ecological infrastructure. The wetlands, the floodplains that give us those important services. Getting very strategic about it, figuring out where, if we can recreate, if we can rebuild, if we can bring ecosystems back, where we're going to get maximum impact from doing that. 2 years ago when the Mississippi was flooding, really serious flood, you all remember it. I remember looking at some research that showed that 35 million acres of wetlands in the upper part of the Mississippi watershed had been drained and put into other land uses, primarily agriculture. 35 million acres is an area the size of Illinois. So it's hard to know, but my guess is if those wetlands had to some degree still been there, we would have had less severe flooding and perhaps a less severe drought this year in the Mississippi, less severe drop in flows this year. Because what do wetlands do? They absorb water like a sponge and then release it gradually. So it mitigates the flood and then mitigates the drought in the following year. So if we'd had some portion of those wetlands back, both of those events, the flood and the drought, may have been less impactful than they were. We'll never know because we can't do that experiment. But the evidence suggests that that's true. After the 1993 Mississippi flood, some work was done looking at this, and researchers estimated that if even 2 to 3% of the wetlands that had been there in the upper Mississippi had been in place, that a portion of the billions of dollars in damages would have been lost. And so strategically looking at where we can rebuild. Australia is beginning to do this very thing in the Murray-Darling. After that, the big dry, what they call the big dry, the decade of drought, followed by this, sort of biblical set of floods in the years after, they realized they really needed to do something dramatically different in the Murray-Darling Basin. And so it's been very, very controversial. But they have now come up with a plan. It was signed into law just a few month or two ago, I guess. And it does a couple of things. It sets what they call sustainable diversion limits on agriculture, on irrigation. And so farmers are looking at pretty significant cuts in their allotment of water. The government is buying water rights. They're using billions of dollars, 9, 10, 11 billion dollars, I think it's up to that now, to purchase water rights from willing sellers in order to get water back into depleted rivers, tributaries, and wetlands. And they're doing this, in a very strategic way. There's a strong scientific element of this that determines where that water should be used to recreate wetlands, to rewater areas that are now dried out, to begin to reestablish floodplain ecosystems, and so on. Of course, the farmers think too much water is going to the environment. The scientists think too little is going to the environment. But it's a really good first step. And it's an experiment kind of worth watching, I think, in terms of how the water market develops and how the ecosystems come back. I was down in the Colorado Delta again just last week, and we now have an incredible potential to do some restoration work down there in the Delta, and even possibly have the Colorado reach the sea again. Right before Thanksgiving, the United States and Mexico signed a very historic agreement that commits them both to giving the Delta some water back. Conservation groups have been working very hard to make this happen. The governments have now signed on to this. It's not a lot of water, but it's enough to do some significant restoration and begin to see the habitats come back, the incredible bird life come back that we know was once there. It's a really, really great opportunity, and one that I, for one, am going to be watching very, very, very carefully. How am I doing? I need to... Okay, we're almost done. The last thing I want to talk about is us. What piece of this is ours, is our responsibility to think about and maybe do something about. This is a little pie chart showing what our personal water footprint looks like if we're an average American. Now, we think about the water that comes out of our tap at home, right? That's maybe 100 gallons, if you're an average American, 100 gallons per person per day coming out of your tap at home. Most of your water footprint, as you can see here, is in your diet. A third of it, half of it is in your diet, a third is in your energy use, and then about 5% at home and 5% in your miscellaneous purchase of clothes and computers and paper and all kinds of other things. So there's a lot we can do in thinking about our water footprint. Ours is about twice as big as the average footprint in the world. So we've got some thinking to do about how we can live just as well, be just as happy, but use less water. And the good news, again, is there's lots we can do. Look how much it takes to make one hamburger in the traditional kind of feedlot beef kind of way. 634 gallons, 630 gallons to make one hamburger. That's like a week's worth of water use at home, right, in one hamburger. So thinking about, I mean, I still eat hamburgers from time to time, but what I try to eat when I do is the one on the right, which is range-fed, grass-fed burger, which uses considerably less water because you're not growing grain to feed the cow. The cow is grazing on grass, which actually can, depending on how the grazing is done, can actually bring carbon out of the atmosphere, increase soil moisture storage, and help repair the carbon and water cycle at the same time. And they taste good. They really taste good. So if we're interested in having a burger, maybe think about, right, shifting from grain-fed to grass-fed. It's a choice, and it's a fairly easy one to make. Here's a cotton shirt. Guess how many gallons of water it takes to make one cotton shirt? 700 gallons of water to make. Most of it is to irrigate the cotton in the field. It's not making the shirt at the factory. It's making the cotton in the field. So drip irrigation, absolutely. But also maybe, how many cotton shirts do we need? You know, I certainly have more cotton T-shirts than I need. So at a 700 gallons a pop, that's a lot. So I did a little calculation. What if the top 1 billion consumers in the world, that includes us and Europe and so on, what if we each bought 2 fewer cotton shirts a year? The amount of water saved is enough to feed 5 million people a decent diet. Those are the kinds of trade-offs we're in, if we've got a finite water supply on the planet. So these are choices. And again, I find it encouraging, empowering, that we can actually do something as an individual to help solve this problem. I want to wrap up with just letting you know about a way in which the folks I work with at National Geographic and some partners of ours are beginning to address, in some sense, this whole picture. We're launching, actually literally this week, a campaign called Change the Course, which is a national freshwater conservation and restoration campaign that brings people into an understanding of their personal water footprint. It uses as a tool the water calculator we built at National Geographic on our site. And we promise that for every pledge made to do something that conserves water in your life, we will return through our campaign 1,000 gallons of water to the Colorado River Basin. We do that by bringing in corporate sponsors who are interested in supporting this campaign to balance out their water footprint. And so we've brought the public and corporations and conservation groups together to actually do some serious restoration and give water back to ecosystems in critical need of it. We're piloting this in the Colorado because it's an iconic river basin that's in desperate need of water from headwater tributaries down to the delta. But our hope is, if it takes off, we can actually do this in other river basins around the country and maybe even internationally, and bring the public and various sectors together to make this happen. So I'm very excited about it. I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much for your attention. Appreciate it.
certain if we're live here. Well, as we change the settings here, I would first like to thank Sandra Postel for joining us here tonight. This has just been extremely informative, and I'm also extremely grateful for all of you who have joined us. I'm grateful for you from my generation, and I'm especially grateful for all the great students who are here tonight. We're counting on you to help fix the things that we've created, and I'm pleased to see so many of you here. We're going to enter into a conversation here, and I just want to remind you that you received 3x5 note cards, or you can obtain more, and I want you to jot down the questions that occur to you as a consequence of the presentation we've just heard. But I want to start this off by asking our panelists to respond to the messages and insights that they've heard. So I'd like to start by first introducing our panelists. And to my immediate right is Dr. Paul Bolstad, my colleague from the Department of Forest Resources here at the University of Minnesota and co-director of the Department of Geography's Master's Program in Geographic Information Sciences. His research has focused on carbon and water cycling from leaf to regional scales, mostly in forest ecosystems, and mostly in the Lake States and southern Appalachian Mountains. He's published over 70 journal papers, several book chapters, and a textbook, GIS Fundamentals. The book is currently in its third edition and has been adopted by over 300 colleges and universities. To his right is Dr. Kate Brauman. She received her PhD in 2010 at Stanford University in the Emmett Interdisciplinary Program in Environment and Resources. She is currently a postdoctoral research scholar here at the Institute on the Environment, where her research focuses on land management, water resources, and human well-being. Prior to graduate school, she worked in public education at the Natural Resources Defense Council. And finally, my colleague, Dr. Deborah Swackhammer, Professor of Science, Technology, and Public Policy at the Humphrey Institute of Public Affairs and Professor of Environmental Health Sciences in the School of Public Health here at the University of Minnesota, co-director of our university's Water Resources Center. Her work focuses on toxic chemicals in the environment and works on policies to address their risk. In 2009, she received the prestigious Founders Award from the Society of Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry for the Lifetime Achievement in Environmental Sciences. So welcome here to our panelists. So I'd like to start with you, Deb, if you could provide a few remarks in response to Sandra's presentation.
I'd be pleased to start. There are a couple of moments where I was really struck, and I actually wrote down things you said because they resonated with me, and they even startled me, even though I think about these things almost as much as you, but not quite. One is the time dimension. You started out saying that the story for the next decade, half century, is going to be about water. You said that narrative is being written every day. I thought that was a wonderful piece of prose, but it struck me that that's right. Starting today, starting yesterday, that narrative is being written. And we tend to think of problems as future problems. In the future, we're going to run out of water. In the future, it's going to be too warm. In the future, we won't have enough food. When the planet has too many people. Well, it's today. And I was struck by the simplicity with which you stated that. And the other thing is to deal with the time is the stationarity issue. I deal a lot with some of the USGS scientists, and they talk a lot about non-stationarity and the fact that we've gotten so used to stationarity and the fact that hydrographs are predictable and they go up and down, but they're predictable. And now everything, all bets are off. We're suddenly in a place in time where we can't predict things very well at all, and that's not comfortable for people that are used to predicting water movement and hydrology. So it's this time thing. We're in a whole other set of rules taking place right now. So it was those two things that really struck me, and then the fact that you can stay optimistic in the face of all of this just amazes me. because, you know, 3/4 of the way through that, I was like, I'm sinking in my chair. I'm thinking, time to go home. I don't know. But you came up with some, your position with the National Geographic Society certainly helps, but you've come up with some very concrete ways to engage people. And I was very inspired by the optimism you showed at the end, and it wasn't just fluff. I mean, you've got some real things to latch onto. So that's what I took away from today's presentation.
Fantastic. Kate.
So I've been thinking a lot about water at a global scale lately and thinking about global agriculture. And so I was excited to see some of your maps of, you know, global water stress. And one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot and that I sort of challenge all of us to think about is that while at some level water is global, it's also deeply regional. And so if it took 6,000 gallons of water to make my hamburger, where did that water come from? And is that water that came from a wet place or a dry place? Is this actually something that's causing stress, or is it not? And I think something that your talk really made me think about was, how do we think about not just some generic t-shirt or hamburger, but how do I know something about my hamburger and my t-shirt and where it came from and what all of the impacts, both in terms of the water consumption but also potentially water pollution, are connected to that, and making the problem more complicated but perhaps making some of the solutions easier as well.
Paul.
Thank you. I wanted to thank you also for a hopeful message, because we often get stuck in a sort of a death spiral of despair when we think about so many of these things, and really that's not at all the case, because I think at least regionally we're in a good location. We're Minnesotans, for God's sake, so we'll always pick the sort of the practical central alternative, I think. To bring the sort of message home, we have to think about really in Minnesota what we're going to be doing over the next, let's say, 30 or 40 years, because right now we've gone through the same transition, or still going through the transition that much of the rest of the country has, but maybe even more so. So 50 years ago, more than half the people lived in rural environments, and now it's about 80%. We're going to add about 1.5 billion more people to the planet in the next 50 years or 70 years, something like that. In Minnesota, we're going to add about another 1 million people, and about 80% of those people are going to be coming here to the Twin Cities, the metro area. So we really have to think, how are we going to handle the water needs of that extra 800,000 people or so in the 7+4 counties that make up the true metropolitan area? Now, it's a hopeful message in that we can plan for that. I also thank you for pointing out in multiple ways that it's not just a problem for dry areas anymore. So in Minnesota, we're seeing outstate, with corn prices being what they are and the returns on investment in irrigation being what they are, places where pumping for crop production is affecting local aquifers to the fact that people are pumping each other's wells dry. And here in the metro, we're seeing sort of the first hints of water shortages. Now, it's interesting, I just read in the paper yesterday that people in Connecticut are starting to sue each other over water. That's a very wet place. People in Georgia and Alabama and Florida have spent most of the last 5 or 6 years suing each other over water. I'm sure some of that will happen here, but if we plan accordingly, I'm hopeful that we can get there.
Interesting. Thank you. So let's turn to some audience questions, and we'll float these past the panelists as they see fit. So here's a question from one of you. Even if we make consumer choices, personal choices, for example, with respect to grass-fed beef and T-shirts, doesn't the way the Farm Bill is set up mean the plants we will still be growing, will be done so with water-intensive practices? So it's a kind of dilemma about personal choices and policy at a very large scale. Who would like to? Sandra, I think I want to have you just take that one at the start, and then, because you've had a little bit of a rest, you've caught your breath, rested your voice, and so the rest of the panelists can think about this.
No, that's a great question, and I don't have all the answers to it. But clearly, I didn't get into the details of policy very much tonight at all. But when it comes to water policy and agriculture policy, we've got some very unfortunate, shall we say, incentives that distort in a fairly dramatic way, how we use land and water. And we'd cite a whole bunch of examples, but I think we're going to really need to get serious about how the policies that come down from the government influence our choices. Right now, we're using scarce water to grow corn to fuel our cars. They're not feeding people or even cows, but cars. I mean, to me, one of the things we're seeing in policy now is, and this worries me greatly, is that we're seeing policies that attempt to solve one problem, say energy, that make the water problem worse, and problems that try to solve the water problem, for example, desalination, that make the energy and climate problem worse. So we've got to get smarter about this and develop policies that solve problems that make each of these water, energy, climate issues better rather than worse. And I think the Farm Bill is an example where we're still promoting very energy-intensive, water-intensive practices, and I think we need to get smarter.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and that the fact that it is hard if you buy one less T-shirt and eat a grain-fed hamburger. It sort of pales in comparison to the impact of the Farm Bill. But it would be nice to see the Farm Bill be restructured so that incentives to cut back on water demand were in there. We tend to focus on supply, and how do we get our supply to be bigger. But it's really, to me, it's about also getting at that demand side. And if the Farm Bill could incentivize drip irrigation, that would be just a huge step in the right direction. To think that only 4% of or 7% again in the U.S. is agriculture is drip irrigated is just crazy. We could make a huge gain. So you've got some really low-hanging fruit that I think could happen on the agricultural side.
So part of the answer to this is some of us are old enough to have lived through the high oil prices in the 70s, and although our total energy consumption is higher now than it was in the 70s, our energy consumption per unit GDP is substantially lower because we started thinking about the cost of energy for once, and we get cars that get double the mileage they used to get, or did something simple like insulated our homes. Until we get the price of water and its true cost reflected in the use, it's going to be hard to make a lot of progress. I think we can still try and make progress, but really it's been considered free. And when there's scarcity and people then start to argue over who has access to it and you start assigning a cost to it, you can get real progress, but it doesn't guarantee real progress. You still look at all the things that are happening in dry areas that are wasteful. So we can get there. It will maybe be messy, but I'm hopeful because we're so early on, and hopefully we can learn from other people's mistakes. I guess the easiest way to acquire wisdom is to imitate somebody else.
So that answer of yours, Paul, kind of bridges to a question one of you had, and it's about energy. Since energy is such a huge portion of our water use, what are the biggest offenders and that can be improved? And what alternatives are most promising? Anyone want to take a crack at that?
So you might want to clarify exactly where your numbers were coming from. Most water use and energy is non-consumptive. So it means that we're taking water, usually out of rivers, and running it through energy plants, power plants, to cool down as a cooling mechanism, and then returning it to a waterway. So not that much of the water is actually consumed. It's still available downstream to use again, and quite often it is. It comes out a lot warmer than it went in. So there's a thermal pollution element to using water in that way. One of the pieces of this puzzle that's really interesting and hard is that while a lot of that water goes back, so you still have water in your streams downstream of your power plant, if you don't have enough water available coming in, then you have a really big problem. And so it's actually very important for power plants to make sure that they're on waterways where there is a sufficient amount of water coming in.
Yeah, Kate's exactly right. And we had a big discussion about this at National Geographic when we were building, and I was working with my team in building the water footprint calculator. The definition of water footprint varies depending on who you're dealing with. And we chose, particularly with energy, to not just deal with the consumption of water. If you look at, for example, we wanted to look at human impact, where our thing was our impact on water, not the water consumption only. If you think about, for example, the Indian Point nuclear plant outside of New York City, Kate's exactly right. They take in water, an enormous amount of water. I think 2.5 times what people in Manhattan use every day to cool the nuclear plant. But it kills 1 billion fish every year. So there's a huge impact, right, on that use of electricity. That even though it's not a consumptive use, there's a big impact. And so we wanted to get a sense of not just our consumption, but our impact on water. And Kate's point is really important, that high energy demand also creates a need for that cooling water to be there. So we've had a situation, particularly in the southeastern U.S., in recent years during droughts, where some nuclear plants came close to having to shut down because there wasn't enough cooling water potentially to come in and cool it. So we chose that definition of sort of impact to give us a sense that the electricity portion of our water footprint is really important from an ecosystem standpoint and a security standpoint.
So I absolutely agree with that. But I also think that, again, in the same sense that there is impact and there's negative sides, there's also interesting potential for upsides. So if you have a nuclear power plant that's close to the mouth of a river and it needs a lot of water, they have a really big financial incentive to make sure that there's water in that river upstream of them. And in ways that if we want to make sure that there are flows in rivers, we might not have the money to engineer otherwise. And so it's certainly possible to think about where there are synergies as well as where there are trade-offs in terms of making sure that there's water in rivers in different places.
Yeah, to put it in perspective, Minnesota, about 75% of our water use is this non-consumptive energy use. So it gets called a use, but it's different in that the water can be used again. Again, in Minnesota, it's concentrated on these large rivers, and it's to produce energy for folks primarily living in cities. The thing that I think we really have to be careful about here is bringing in this notion and remembrance of non-stationarity, because there's all sorts of unforeseen circumstances that could affect this. About half the water that falls from the sky is used by plants. In round numbers, it depends on where you are and the climate and lots of things. But if you had to pick a number and not be a scientist for a day and actually give a person a number, then it's about 50%. That number varies from year to year and place to place, even in the humid east, from 30 to 70%. There's a lot of difference in those numbers, 30 to 70%. So we have, for example, research by Peter Reich or Lee Freilich that suggest, and other folks, that the composition of the forest is going to change. You'll get different kinds of trees further north. It'll look more like the Ozarks in central and northern Minnesota than like Alaska, for example. Well, the plant consumption can change. Some of these diffuse porous species use less water than the ring porous species, so you could have a 10 or 15 or 20% drop. This non-stationarity will make it difficult to plan. So we really have to think about what do you do, how do you find these synergies that not only sort of reduce the consumption, but make your system more robust.
Excellent. Could I just ask panelists that you need to speak a little closer, maybe even almost eat your microphones.
So in Minnesota, we are definitely seeing, already we're seeing where we potentially could run out of water for cooling, and a great deal of our water is used for that. We're also seeing a movement by the industry to move to looping water for cooling multiple times, then it becomes a consumptive use. And it's no longer a non-consumptive use, so we're seeing non-stationarity in even our dominant use of water in the state. It's really shifting, and we don't know the unintended consequences of moving to those systems. I don't think they've been thought through or discussed as much as they probably should be.
So let's flip to the consumptive use of water. And one of you asked the question, and it's kind of about refurbishing water. How do we refurbish water? And in particular, how do wetlands purify water?
I'll take a go at this one.
Thank you.
So wetlands purify water in a couple of different ways. As water is moving through them, you're getting uptake of all kinds of nutrients, so nitrogen and phosphorus, all kinds of stuff that ends up in water is actually taken up by the plants through their roots and metabolized. You get, because water is moving slowly through these, if you've ever tried to walk through a wetland, you won't be surprised to know that as water moves slowly through it, you get sediment that gets hung up on the plants themselves. And because water hangs out in wetlands for a long time, you get both in the root zone by bacteria and also in the plants themselves. You just have a lot more time for some of these processes that would happen even on dry land to actually occur and clean water up. So especially if you're looking to take things like nutrients out of water, wetlands are very effective at that.
Excellent. So shifting in another direction, why aren't we talking about reversing population growth? There's no hope long-term of fixing the water problems unless growth stops.
We don't really have to worry about reversing population growth. All we have to do is educate women. And that may be sort of surprising, but if you look at in the world where we give women the chance to make decisions about childbirth, and we basically give them an education, the population problem, as it was described by Paul Ehrlich, takes care of itself. If you look at all the population data coming out of the UN, it's nothing but a hopeful sign. I remember when the projections were 11 billion people or 12 billion people, and every year they seem to get to a smaller and smaller number. If you look at the demography of Europe and even the demography of Asia, we'll be talking about how do we make an economy work with a shrinking world population. Now, I'll probably be dead by then, but some of you alive, some of you in this room, I certainly will be alive, and we'll be dealing with that problem as it is. So I think it's, in my mind, one of management. You know, humans and chimpanzees share 95% of our genetic material, and maybe that explains a lot of the decisions we make. But in the long run, I'm hopeful in that as we become richer and as women get educated, really, and can make reproductive choices that are in their children's best interest, the population problem fixes itself.
Any of you women choose to comment?
A whole bunch of things came to mind, but I'm going to just hold my tongue. But I do want to point out the connection back to water. That's that women in sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, they don't have access to fresh water, and they have to walk 8 hours a day to get a gallon of water. The 2 billion people on the planet don't have access to adequate sanitation, and as a result, because many of these schools don't have adequate sanitation, girls drop out of school at age 10, age 12, because when they start to menstruate, they are not going to be going to school and doing that in some sort of an open situation. So what happens is the education of the girls stops in villages and towns and countries and regions of the world where there's not adequate water and sanitation. So you're correct, but it actually comes right back to the water issue.
But the last I heard, these problems are the largest in male-dominated political systems. So it's probably not just a single-gender educational issue. All right, so different zone here. How do we get the price right, so to speak, for water? In other words, what measures could be taken to help us value water correctly?
Well, right now, when we pay our water bill, we pay for the cost of distribution. We don't pay for the lost leakage, which in Minnesota, I'm guessing, is probably somewhere around 10%, probably the nation's average. And we don't pay into the future for replacing our infrastructure. So we have this huge debt that we're building up of having to replace our infrastructure. And this is just for domestic water. And so we don't pay the true cost if we had to actually replace our drinking water plants, if we had to pay for that leakage. And what we really don't pay for, although it's not the biggest missing piece, we don't pay for the lost ecosystem services for having pulled that water out of the environment and built a plant and piped it to our houses. We don't pay for those lost services. And if you put all of those things into the price of water, it might go up quite a bit, might double. And where people have tried to do this, where countries have tried to do this, very few, people they break into the pipes. They're not going to pay the difference. They get water some other way. They dig a hole, they dig a new well in their backyard. And so it's really tough to change the price of water. We are so used to having it be free, and it's unfortunate. But there are ways to make. I mean, those are the basic reasons why water is so less expensive compared to what it should be. But how to get there, I'm not sure. Do you have ideas on how to get there?
Sandra.
Well, I think it's true. We pay less for water than we do for our cable bill. For our cable TV service in most cases. So we're not really, worrying so much about the cost of water. I think it's very important to differentiate sort of luxury uses of water from basic needs of water. As Deb pointed out, 1 billion people don't have access to safe drinking water. They're paying an arm and a leg for, basic needs levels of water from a truck that comes around, to their slum dwellings every once in a while, and the water's of dubious quality, but they pay sometimes a quarter of their income because, of course, they need water. So from a pricing perspective, what I think is important is to have a basic needs level that's affordable by everybody, and then you ratchet it up so that you get an incentive at the high end of consumption to bring it down. And we've seen this work in agriculture, where you've got an irrigation district that's used to paying, very, very low prices, but jack it up for the last 10 or 20% of the water use, and all of a sudden there's an incentive for the farmer to use 10 or 20% less water. So you get drip irrigation, you get more efficient use of water. So that kind of stepped, pricing, that kind of tiered pricing can make a big difference. And I think Deb raised a really important point, is that we don't pay for ecosystem services. We don't pay for the services that freshwater ecosystems are giving us, by and large. And so what some colleagues and I have talked about is this idea of a sustainability, what we've called a sustainability boundary. The idea that we should think about capping the use of water or the withdrawals of water at a place that protects those ecosystem services that matter to us. So you can think about it similar to a carbon cap in a way, right, where you want to make sure that you don't go beyond some level where the cost of that water withdrawal is more than the benefit you're getting from it. So in some sense, the Great Lakes Compact does that to a little bit of a degree. We've seen in Texas the Edwards Aquifer cap on pumping, so that the aquifer stays at a level that sustains the springs where some endangered species live. It's a cap. And what happens when you put in that cap is that all of a sudden a very active water market pops up. You've got San Antonio using 34% less water than it did before, because there's an incentive to use the water efficiently. I actually don't think we're going to get most of that incentive from pricing. I think we're going to get it from these caps and these sustainability boundaries, and saying, we want to protect this, let's make sure we don't take so much water that we lose it. This is the principle behind what they're doing in Australia right now, too, with these sustainable diversion limits. So I think that's kind of an interesting way to think about, in some sense, maximizing the value of water, because you're making sure you've got the value protected in ecosystems, and you're getting value from the extractive uses, too, but in a much more efficient way.
I think this question has some interesting parallels to the question that was asked earlier about the Farm Bill. And so this question of, well, if you pay at home a little bit more for water, then you'll probably use less of it. And so there's sort of a personal choice aspect of conserving, but we also really need to think about some of the bigger structures that govern how water is used. So we talked a lot, and you talked a lot about agriculture as a big driver of water use. But if you look at the way water law is structured throughout the United States and in many ways throughout the world, it's designed it is not designed around conservation. It's really designed to use it or lose it. And there are lots of built-in incentives not to conserve in both the western states and in eastern states where the laws are a little bit different. And so there are lots of business interests, of course, who are interested in maintaining the status quo. People are making money off of the way that the situation looks now. And at the same time, I think that if we really want to change how people are using water, put caps on water use, that there's going to have to be, in the end, a big national conversation about how we want these kinds of laws to look and how we want to allocate water, because this is really going to end up being a macro national level allocation issue at the end of the day for some of these big questions. The same way that the Farm Bill, it's important to make thoughtful personal choices, and we also need to think about changing national laws, changing things like the Farm Bill because of what they incentivize or don't incentivize.
All right. I think we'll be able to handle two more questions before we have to conclude. And this next one is in a different zone than agriculture and personal use. And it says, please comment on the following water-intensive industries: production of bottled water, production of biofuels, especially ethanol from corn, and 3, sulfide mining for extraction of non-ferrous metals. Big question. Several parts.
They seem to be Minnesota-specific questions.
They are. Well, partly. Yeah.
We don't bottle. I don't believe we have big bottling plants here. I know that it costs a lot of water. Like I don't believe it's 8 liters of water to make 1 plastic liter bottle. I think that the manufacture of the bottles is where the big water consumption comes in, and that it's all ridiculous, of course. But
it's still.
Yeah, and the same with biofuels. We love to pick on biofuels from a water perspective, but it's a local issue. It's how much you pump locally to make the ethanol, and it doesn't get to the corn issue and how much corn. That's another issue in terms of food versus fuel. But water versus ethanol, the water question, the water consumption in Minnesota it's on a state level teeny. On a county level or on a watershed basis, it can be quite large. So it ends up being a local issue. What was the third one?
The third was sulfide mining for extraction of non-ferrous
I
metals.
was hoping we forgot the third one.
You asked.
Yeah, I did. From a water use perspective, certainly mining is a big use of water in the states. About 10% of our use in the state. Compared to other states, that's pretty big. These new mines will use water. Probably, I actually don't know if they'll use more or less water. But the big issue around these mines is the water quality issue of producing acidic water as a result of the mining process. And so that seems to be the bigger issue with the mining question.
Anyone else want to?
So they're all small.
Rank?
I mean, they're all small in terms of a state consumption perspective. They're local issues.
Got it. All right, the last question. So, and this really is a question, and I suspect many young people here who are creative and innovative are thinking and wondering how they could contribute to solutions. And so this is a question that kind of bridges on that topic. What about places like Israel, where people are experimenting with growing crops vertically behind glass walls in high-rise buildings? Are things like that, are innovations like that feasible, significant, and economical? So take that question and then think more broadly about innovation and what is needed. Kate?
I think there are a lot of layers of an answer to that question. And for local reasons, those kinds of approaches can be really effective, especially if you're growing high-value crops that you're able to sell efficiently. Israel has a lot of sunshine, and so they potentially have a lot of solar energy. On the other hand, you're never going to feed the world with vertical crops, not like that. You're just not producing that many calories doing it that way. You're usually producing vegetables. Most people get most of their calories from cereal grains. no one ever tries to talk about, indoor vertical urban wheat gardens. But, I mean, if we're really talking about feeding the world, we got to be thinking about, wheat and corn and rice. And these kinds of indoor urban gardens can be incredibly energy intensive. And so, as Sandra mentioned, we really need to make sure that we're thinking about the interacting nexus of food and water and energy. And that's not to say that there's not lots of places where these kinds of approaches make sense on a small scale or to address specific needs. But it's not something that I would want to think about scaling up, worldwide and feeding sub-Saharan Africa that way.
It's interesting because one of the issues has been that drip irrigation, for example, which we've been talking about, generally hasn't been practical for wheat, rice, and corn, which has been a concern because, as Kate mentioned, those are their staple grains, and most of our ag land is planted in those crops. But I was talking with a couple years ago with the managing director of Jain Irrigation, which is the second biggest drip irrigation company in the world, and they're the biggest drip irrigation company in India. And he told me that they're doing a lot of work now experimenting with drip irrigation of rice, of upland rice. And he sees that turning into $1 billion market just in India. So the idea that you can take the staple grain of Asia, where water is so scarce, and maybe at some point begin to drip irrigate some portion of it is, to me, hugely hopeful, that we can find a way, because rice is the most water intensive of the staple grains because of the way we grow it, flooding the field, lots of loss to evaporation, and so on. So the idea that this might happen and be an effective way of growing rice is pretty encouraging.
Although, in fact, it turns out that the reason most people do drip irrigation is actually for weed control.
Well, yes and no. It's weed control, it's salt management, and it's water scarcity.
So there's all kinds of really interesting questions that are linked up with switching technologies that aren't just about water. So I think it's really exciting to think about both what some of the potential technologies are now, but also what new technologies might be and what you might think up that's going to solve some of these problems.
I have a question. $7 a bushel corn will pay for a lot. Will it pay for drip irrigation, do you think? I mean, would you see that being likely or possible, even within the realm of possibilities, for something like corn in the Midwest?
There's some farmers in western Kansas that are growing corn with Ogallala aquifer water that are using some drip irrigation on corn. I mean, it's not terribly economic, but if your groundwater is being depleted and you're pumping from greater depths, the economics of that changes. But I can see a day at some point where we're going to be drip irrigating corn. Yeah.
Well, this is amazing. We have a real brain trust here in the form of our featured speaker tonight, Sandra Postel. I want to thank her so much for coming here to Minnesota, being with us near the headwaters of the Mississippi River. To our panelists, thank you so very much for your participation. This has been a great discussion. And thanks to all of you for joining us here. And we look forward to seeing you again soon at the next installment of the Moose Lectureship. Thanks so very much and good night.